It's me again. This is social justice in debating. This is part of a series of videos that I'm doing. I've done a feminism video, which will be uploaded, I think, around the same time as this one, which looks maybe in a bit more detail at some of the things I'm going to be introducing and talking about here. But basically, this is just not a comprehensive by any stretch of the imagination, but just a good overview of like how to start approaching social justice motions. And mainly I'm talking about like prep time and questions to ask yourself for these kinds of things, rather than anything more specific about like stock analysis that can be used, etc. Okay, so in terms of structure of the presentation, I'm going to talk through some motions now, and I'll explain that in a second. Then after that, we'll go into a sort of more detailed, like strategic framing kind of thing. And then after that, we'll go into just a bit of stuff about impacting. It should be a super quick video. I say that in every single one that I make, and then I lie every single time. I think this slide, so talking about some motions, is probably going to take up the bulk of the video. I think I find the most useful approach with social justice is to just stream of consciousness, like conversations with my partner about just about the motion are pretty useful in the first couple of minutes of prep time, so you can figure out like what's going on and the particular problems at hand, and all of that kind of stuff. So I thought what would be really useful as the start of the presentation is to have just like 5 very different motions that are talking about like quite different things, and just essentially do by myself what I would do with someone else were they to be here, which is just to kind of like figure out what's going on. We'll get into then after in the next couple of slides the next stuff that you can do to make that like BP and debate worthy. So first of all, the first motion we have is this House opposes the academization of social justice movements, meaning the increasingly significant presence of academics and academic terminology, processes and structures in many parts of the world. So the first couple of thoughts that I have is I think that this is coming down to the capacity of people to engage within this whichever social justice movement we're talking about. So if you have much more like academic language or specific language being used, how capable are people of entering into conversations then about, or within this debate, how capable of are people in participating? So if the feminist movement, for example, starts to adopt very, very like specific and scientific rhetoric, or is promoting like read all of these articles in order to understand, like scientific articles or social articles about like the feminist movement and stuff, how does that exclude people from it, and then how does it allow people to participate more effectively? So I think here what comes to mind is this conversation about like closed versus open movements, i.e. like the like Lenin stuff, which is like a small collected revolutionary movement in comparison to some grandiose idea of like a lot of people participating in like slow liberalization of stuff. So which is more helpful for a movement to adopt? This is potentially what we're looking at. Alternatively, what we can be looking at is the capacity to make things seem more professional or develop in that kind of way. Like, so what is the point of the movement and what are they trying to achieve? I think is like a useful starting place for this one. Moving on then to motion number 2, this House believes that the LGBTQ+ movement should emphasise family values as part of their activism, rather than adopt the view that family values do not matter. So again, much like a lot of these things, it's coming down to, I think, like a lot of this is coming down to like buy-in. So how are you capable of like making people identify or come into or bring people into the movement? So I think that this is playing into the idea that like if the queer movement is being pushed by people who are not in line with a lot of family value structures, like they're not getting married, they're not wanting to have kids or whatever, then are they if those are the face of the movement, and then how are they alienating people? If you promote ideas of like traditional like marriage relationships, but just it's like two men rather than a man and a woman, then how does that allow people to have a greater amount of like, or does this bring in like the more conservative people who may be turned off of the movement otherwise? But then I think what's really important is like what the tipping point here is. So tipping point meaning what is the thing that is actually going to push the change, or like push over into change that you want. So if you have a couple more conservative people think, yeah, maybe gay people aren't that bad, what actually happens with that? Are you going to achieve political change, or are you just going to make like some people's lives a little bit better? Like what's actually happening? And then on the flip side of that, I think it's also important to talk about how this potentially alienates people. If for example, if it's very difficult for two women to have children because of all of like the financial barriers that occur for like surrogacy or whatever, is this going to alienate people who then choose not to have children, or like push people into making decisions that they didn't otherwise want to? So how does the like capacity of the movement to achieve change get impacted by this like potential alienation that exists? I'm going to pause here and say that everything that I've said for that last motion and the motion before is insufficient to be included in a debate. Like if you just said any of the stuff that I said in a debate, that wouldn't do very well for you. What you need to do is you need to think about these ideas. So the reason that I'm stream of consciousnessing is because I think that then allows you to formulate these ideas into specific argumentation cases. I think this is quite useful for people to do at the beginning of debating. So this is very much one of the beginner videos that we're doing for the SSDC, because I think that as soon as you've done enough social justice motion stuff, you get much better at that like immediate initial assessment of like what the conflict in the debate is going to be, what the clash in the debate is going to be, and then you can get started with the argumentation stuff much faster. Whereas what we're doing now is potentially what's more useful for if it's like one emotion that you just don't know a lot about, or two, if you're not super in tune with debating at the moment. Okay, with that being said, let's move on to the next one. So motion number 3. This House believes that environmentalists should campaign for environmental justice as opposed to overall protection of the environment. This begs the question, is environmentalism a form of social justice? I think it is. I also don't care enough to say that it like have an argument about it. So if you think that it's not, then you can skip like a minute or two to when I'm done talking about this. But I think it is. Particularly speaking, also if we're talking about environmental justice, I think that is as well. So environmental justice, in case you don't know, is the idea that like some people in the world are disproportionately affected by environmental degradation or like biohazards or whatever. So whether that's people being exposed to more chemicals, or like more coal burning being in certain areas, and then therefore that having a disproportionate impact on the like air quality. So this looks like you know, in the capital of India having a higher smog level because they're being pushed towards that kind of production capacity, whereas London has a much lower smog level in that relation. I mean, both of them have higher smog levels, but like, you know what I mean? I'm talking about like the capacity of some areas because of the way that the world is set economically uneven. It means that some people have a higher burden to produce or are impacted more by certain kind of environmental degradation. So environmental justice then looks at pushing for that kind of inequality to be rectified. So solutions to like high levels of pollution in you know, certain rivers in places or whatever, and trying to fix that, rather than necessarily trying to fix the environment as a whole, is what this motion is getting at. So I think it then becomes like a question of, one, if you push for environmental justice, is that going to make more people identify with the movement, in the same way that saying like, I'm saving starving children in Africa, and then showing a picture of like a starving child in Africa makes people feel good if they donate things, rather than saying like there is a huge amount of like food unequal food distribution, therefore I'm going to take some of your food away, right? Like the latter seems like, you know, an attack, whereas the former seems like, yes, I'm being a really good person and doing super good charity stuff. So if the environmentalists start to campaign for environmental justice, it's possible that that can achieve similar things as campaigning for the overall protection of the environment, but it makes more people feel like they're willing to join in because they feel like they're doing like a good thing, or whatever. Alternatively, it looks like placing blame in the global order, and people don't like that. So again, I think this comes down to, in a lot of ways, about like buy-in capacity, and I think that that's something that gets repeated a lot within social justice. Is if you're trying to cause change to happen, people need to be involved and money needs to be involved. So what is the best means of achieving people and money often is what the debate comes down to. I'll get into impacting later on in the video, but I think that's where we're at. So moving on then to motion number 4, this House believes that the feminist movement should encourage women in the developing world to take up vigilante justice. I actually think this is one of the first debates that I ever did in university. I have like this vague memory in my mind. If William is watching this, please do not find the tab and put in my speaks, because that would be really, really embarrassing. Anyway, vigilante justice looks like yeah, it's like, you know, Batman, right? Like, I'm going to commit crimes in order to get the justice that the legal system doesn't get for me, right? So it looks like I can't remember where this is usually talked about, but it looks like, you know, a group of women coming up and like killing someone who's assaulted a woman who they are trying to protect or whatever. So like, you know, taking justice into their own hand, right? So I think this is important in terms of like optically, what does this look like? Is this going to increase the protection of women? Maybe. Is this going to cause a crackdown on women? Maybe. Is this going to cause legal shifts to alleviate the responsibility of vigilante justice? Potentially. I think you could also make like a principle here, a principle case here. Someone could, I wouldn't, but someone could, about like whether or not so this is an important consideration, right? So the feminist movement is probably overwhelmingly considered to be run by and run on like Western narratives and perspective, because that's where a lot of money and attention and support is situated. So if the US has very good women's rights in comparison to a lot of the world, I'm not saying that it has like fantastic women's rights, but if it's disproportionately better, and if there's a lot of money and media attention and you know, like just the capacity to get involvement and money and attention, then that's probably what's controlling the narrative a lot of times. So if this looks like then the feminist movement within a Western structure attempting to legitimize women in the developing world to take up vigilante justice, so if this looks like women in the developed world directing women in the developing world to, you know, be violent and engage in violent actions, then I think that there's some kind of power imbalance that should be talked about there, about whether or not that's a legitimate thing to do and whether or not that's like pushing onto responsibility onto other people, or whatever, right? And so then it also becomes a question of whether or not international support for vigilante groups engaging in vigilante justice is going to be you know, is going to happen or whatever. So I think that's my initial thoughts for motion 4. Motion 5, I actually don't know if this is a social justice motion, but I did put it in because this is from the Astana Euros, and St Andrews is owed money by the Astana Euros committee, and they've not given it to us, and I think that it's important that this get flagged. So please give us back the money that you owe us. It's quite a lot of money, and it would make a huge, meaningful difference to our capacity to continue to exist as a society. So please give us the money. Anyone who's watching this, if you ever meet anyone who is on the Astana Euros org.com, tell them that they owe us money. Thank you. This is a PSA from St Andrews. Anyway, the motion is this House would transfer management of all water resources to an international body. I think what's important here, or my initial thoughts here are situated in, is this is probably trying to question whether or not you get a more equitable distribution of water resources or a like more competent distribution of water resources. So if an international body exists and is capable of having zero loyalties, then it would be more capable then of encouraging water distribution in an equitable way across the world, including into areas that currently lack safe drinking water. There are a few things that I think come up as an immediate issue in this. So first of all, it's very easy to construct water systems that cause or support unequal systems. So this looks like the canal system that was built in Pakistan by the British Raj, which is able to lift or lower essentially like dam structures to direct water into canals. And it was fantastic in theory, because in theory it had a great amount of water distribution encouraged throughout countryside and areas that didn't have it, which meant, you know, more capacity to grow crops, but also just people access safe water, or you know, just water in general, which is like needed to live. The issue is that because it was controlled by the people in power, so British Raj or whatever, it meant that they could lower it, and they did lower it to stop people who lived at the end of the canal systems from getting water occasionally, which meant that those people were then reliant on the people who were upstream from them, who had a consistent level of access to water. So obviously the richest people and the people who were in favour of the ruling elite were moved to the top, and then the people at the end or very downstream were those who were not necessarily useful to the ruling elite, or they didn't rely on them in any way. I think that that's an example of the way in which that equal distribution or greater capacity to distribute water can be done in such a way that props up, encourages, or even like turns over the wealth disparity that exists. So although in theory it looks like equal access to water is like a great thing and possible to achieve with an international body regulating things, I think it's far more likely that pre-existing social and international control or power would be replicated in water distribution, right? So if we think about any pre-existing international bodies that exist, like the UN, or like more like regional bodies like the EU, ASEAN in Southeast Asia, or even just like the global one like the IMF, a question gets raised about, do any of these encourage equal power sharing within the bodies, right? The EU is always dubbed as being disproportionately controlled by Germany because that's where the wealth within the EU is, you know, majoritarianly situated. The UN Security Council has encourages huge power imbalance between the like P5+1 and everyone else. Like there's a huge just because an international body exists and people are quote unquote equal participants does not mean that they are actually able to participate in an equal way, or that these bodies exist in order to represent them in an equal way. So I think what this motion does is it's attempting to make you beg the questions of whether or not these bodies will engage in like good faith action, and whether or not social justice, i.e. in this case equitable access to water, actually does occur. The important thing here is the comparative, right? So water distribution and status quo is shit. So even if it's like bad on the alternative, is it better? And is it like permanently better, or, you know, long-term, short-term way? So that's important as well. So with all of these debates, then you need to think about the comparative. That's crucially important. So even if like you can prove that it's a bit shit, is it better than it would have been on the alternative? Also, if we're talking about social justice and justice, it would be very just if Astana were to give us our money back. Cool. So that's just a conversation about some motions. I think it's just like a good window into my mind about like when these motions come out and like thoughts that get involved. My knowledge distribution is unequal, so I have more knowledge about some of these motions than I do about others, and that will inevitably inform the cases that I want to make out of them and the conversations that I have in prep time. But oftentimes I find it really useful to have a conversation, so you make sure that you're on the same page Because the thing with social justice is that it's dependent on personal experience, the way that you identify or understand topics, right? I'm a woman, that impacts the way that I understand the feminist movement, etc., etc. So it's important that you and your partner have these conversations so that you understand the context which each other is sitting. Cool. Okay, so I put this in so that we could have a more in-depth discussion about something and then move on to strategic framing. But I actually think that we did quite a lot of that in the last slide, so I'll keep this quite brief. So specifically, this was about the LGBTQ+ movement and family values stuff. So I think what's really important then to understand the strategic framing, this looks like if you're an opening government, how you set up the control that the movement has and how you then analyze and prove certain things will be dependent on the clashes or the disagreements that are going to emerge throughout the debate, right? So you have to set up how this is likely to occur and all of that kind of stuff, and you have to provide analysis as to why all of that will be the case. But in order to do any of that well, you need to be doing it strategically to preempt material that might come out of the other side, and also just to make sure that you're being clear. So I think that in this debate, key clashes and disagreements are like buy-in, political shifts that can occur, accurate representation of like movement ideals and stuff. So is it like, consistently possible for the LGBTQ+ movement to emphasize family values if family values are like the antithesis of the LGBTQ+ movement? Not saying that it is, but I'm just saying that you've got to ask that question. And then fourthly, the capacity to access specific areas of the population or like specific areas of improvement. So my example that I used on the last slide was if a lesbian couple finds it difficult to have children, blah, blah, blah. But if you're emphasizing family values as important, then you're potentially having greater capacity to access, buy-in to achieve that kind of stuff. But all of this is centered on the question of like who or what matters. So you've got to prove and do weighing within the debate about like if two changes occur, so you get more conservative people in the LGBTQ+ movement or like identifying with it or supporting it or whatever, and then that also means that on the flip side you get maybe a less accurate representation of views of the majority of LGBTQ+ movement or whatever, but they're probably not going to leave the movement. Then you need to do some weighing then to tell me which of those things is more important, because without that I'm left with just two questionable impacts and I don't know what is meaningful. So that's all the important stuff. And then I think finally, this is stuff that we've already talked about, like what does motion look like, what does emphasis look like. I think it's also important to understand that you're always making concessions in debates. So there exists like scarce resources and opportunity costs, right? Like even if the resource itself is just like time, I have a limited amount of time that I can spend, a limited amount of tension that I'll spend, and a limited amount of like political support that I'm going to give. So you need to make sure that you're like being aware of the sacrifices that you're making and the trade-offs that you're making, and that's where weighing becomes super important. Is it's capable of saying, look, I don't mind losing this because I've gained something way more important, etc., etc. And then method of adoption and promotion is just like, what does the movement do in order to do this emphasis, right? Does this look like campaigning online? Does this look like pride campaigns being much more like in line with family values, rather than necessarily being at the moment, I mean the ones I've been to, like reasonably raucous or whatever. So it looks like that question of shifting, so what choices you make. Cool. So finally then, this is the last slide. I told you this would be a short video on impacting. Okay, just a brief little economics thing. You can make like economics cases in a lot of debates, and particularly in social justice. I think it's underloved and underappreciated as something that is important. Like I was saying before, scarce resources and scarce time. If I'm donating to a charity, I make choices about how I donate based on like personal influence or like influence of like my situations and life experiences, etc., etc. So if you are wanting me to donate towards like LGBT causes, or like if you're wanting to enact change and you need money to do that, then you need to like consider that and give analysis to that effect. But additionally, I think that money is also just super important. Like political campaigns cost a lot, lobbying costs a lot, just achieving change costs a lot. Even like striking or political protests, all of that is like the opportunity cost of, if I'm not going to work, then I'm losing that money, which means that you need to find means of keeping things going for enough time without people like leaving because they run out of money or whatever. But additionally, I think access to capital is super important. So marginalized groups are often less likely to achieve economic success for a huge variety of reasons. So if you can prove that individuals are more capable of having access to capital, like they get better jobs, they have a greater capacity to start their own businesses or whatever of that kind of stuff, then I think that's also a super important impact, because we live in a capitalist society, blah blah blah. So capital is like essential in order to be able to like achieve like agency or act freely or whatever. And yeah, there's opportunity cost stuff that I've been talking about. Another common impact that people go for is like role models or icons, or the capacity to develop community is also super important, but you need to tell me why. So as a young woman, seeing a woman in a position of power within a field that I want to go into is super important, because it makes me feel like that's an achievable goal. That means that people then strive for that and are more likely to achieve that. Role models in power also means that you're far more likely to have them be aware of the issues that are faced and want to set things up. I talk about all of this a bit more in my feminism stuff, but equally community is super important. So if LGBTQ people often talk about things like chosen families, this looks like if I get like disowned because people don't agree, if people are homophobic basically, or if I feel isolated because I'm the only gay kid in my school or whatever, finding community online or finding community through things is super important in allowing people to develop the capacity for self-expression, again, agency, all that jazz, blah blah blah. But note that you need to talk about how this is meaningful, so how each of these things necessarily improves the quality of life of some people, and why those people are the most important, and why we care. So again, this last bullet point, why do we care about the people we do, is everything that debates need to come down to. So I think that impacting is super important and often underdone, but impacting includes, or good impacting includes within it, weighing, which is explaining why the things that you achieve are important. If I sharpen a pencil, and that's the impact of the debate, it's meaningless unless you tell me why sharpening the pencil is important. You know what I mean? Like if I can prove something that happens, but like, whatever, right? Like it doesn't matter in an abstract. Everything matters within some kind of, or you need to explain why everything matters in some grand sense. So if a young gay kid goes on, plays like League of Legends and finds a community there of other gay kids, I don't know, then maybe that's super meaningful and important for all of them, and it means that they can all feel a greater amount of self-expression, and they feel better about themselves, and they feel the capacity to exist in a world where they might have otherwise only experienced like hostility to their identity, right? Like this is all super important stuff, and some of it will come down to just rhetoric in terms of the explanation of why things are important, so don't be afraid of that, but that's what weighing is. So you need to tell me like proximity, short term, long term, just general importance, all of that kind of stuff, and that's where the clashes and the communication within the debate comes in. So this was, still long, but it was shorter than my other ones. So if you want any more depth stuff, then feminism is like coming up, and then I'm also going to do a video on movements, and then also on narratives, all of which are kind of within the scope of this kind of jazz. So cool.